Hey everybody, this video is called The Disappointing End, and today we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2nd Chronicles, where we're going to be looking at the disappointing end of King Asa as God's going to rebuke him. And there's probably been many stories that you've had read in your life of a character that really draws your interest in their life, but they have a very disappointing ending to their story. And this is the kind of guy right here that we're going to be talking about today. So 2nd Chronicles chapter 16 verse 1 through 3 starts out, in the 36th year of the reign of Asa, Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might let none go out or come into Asa, king of Judah. Then Asa brought silver and gold from the treasuries of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and sent to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, who dwelt in Damascus, saying, let there be a treaty between you and me, as there was between my father and your father. See, I have sent you silver and gold. Come, break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so that he will withdraw from me. So, since Baasha ruled between 909 to 886 BC, he died in the 26th year of Asa's reign, as we saw back in 1 Kings 15:33. And this could not mean that they were at war 10 years later. However, if the time reference was to the 35th year since the kingdom was divided, then the year would be 896 BC, in the 14th year of Baasha's reign, in the 16th of Asa's reign. And this manner of reckoning was generally followed in the book of the record of the kings of Judah and Israel, and the public annuals of that time, from which inspired the writer drew his account. And this could be cause for defections of people from Israel to Judah, as we saw back in the last chapter last Saturday in verse 9 in 1 Kings 15 verse 16 and 17. And Ramah was approximately 6 miles north of Jerusalem. And because of the topography and the fortification of this city, this would effectively block all traffic into Jerusalem from the north. And in verse 3 we see my father, your father, in its previously unmentioned treaty between Abijah and Tabor Rimmon. And Asa, he seems to have forgotten that his covenant was with God and not with a pagan king. And under the covenant they made with God through the Lord was responsible to protect Judah. And now they invested their treasure and their trust in a pagan king. And Asa would find that Ben-Hadad and Syria were worse enemies than Israel. In verse 4 through 6 it says, so Ben-Hadad heeded King Asa and sent the captains of his armies against the cities of Israel. They attacked Ijon, Dan, Abel, Maim, and all the stored cities of Naphtali. Now it happened, when Baasha heard it, that he stopped building Ramah and seized his work. Then King Asa took all Judah, and they carried away the stones and timber of Ramah, which Baasha had used for building, and with them he built Geba and Mizpah. So, along with these other cities that are mentioned, these 10 cities are located north and east of the Sea of Galilee. And Geba and Mizpah were approximately 2 miles northeast and 2 miles east of Ramah, respectively. In verse 7 through 9 it says, and at that time Hanani the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, because you have relied on the king of Syria and have not relied on the Lord your God, therefore the army of the king of Syria has escaped from your hand. Where the Ethiopians and the Libum were not a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen. Yet, because you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. In this you have done foolishly. Therefore, from now on, you shall have wars. So, verses 7 through 9 here, God used the prophet Hanani to rebuke Asa for his wicked appropriation of the temple treasures devoted to God to purchase power, and for his faithless dependence on a pagan king instead of the Lord. In contrast to before, when opposed by Egypt back in chapter 14, verse 9 through 15. In Asa, he forfeited by the sin of opportunity of gaining great victory, not only just over Israel, but over Syria. And this could have been a greater victory than over the Ethiopians, which would have deprived Syria of any future successful attacks against them. Though God had delivered them when they were outnumbered, the king showed his own spiritual decline, both in his lack of trust and in the treatment of the prophet of God who spoke the truth from God. And the Ethiopians are people from south of Egypt, and the Libyans, they're from North Africa, west of Egypt. In verse 9, it shows divine judgment on the king's faithlessness. And we don't know much about this prophet Hanani besides what we see here. But we see the prophet Hanani was a faithful prophet of the Lord who spoke his bold word to the king here. And that his son was also a prophet who spoke to Baasha, the king of Israel, and to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. In verse 10 it says, Then Asa was angry with the seer and put him in prison, for he was enraged at him because of this. And Asa oppressed some of the people at that time. So, some of the people were those who agreed with the prophet Hanani. They received the word of the Lord openly. But instead of receiving the prophet's word from God, we see that King Asa goes off the deep end. He attacks the messenger of the Lord, and he attacks the prophet instead of receiving humbly what the prophet had to say. And we see that Asa was a enraged man, a very angry man, and he did not only go after God's prophet, but we see that he turned against others in the process who were committed to God and could see the error of the king's ways. And as a man of compromise and unbelief, the presence of those truly loyal to God was convicting and oppressive to Asa. In verse 11 through 14, I also wanted to mention that he had Hanani put into prison. We saw it in verse 10. Verse 11 through 14. Note that the acts of Asa, first and last, are indeed written in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. And in the 39th year of his reign, Asa became diseased in his feet, and his malady was severe. Yet in his disease he did not seek the Lord, but the physicians. So Asa rested with his fathers. He died in the 41st year of his reign. They buried him in his own tomb, which he had made for himself in the city of David, and laid him in the bed, which was fulfilled with spices and various ingredients prepared in a mixture of ointments. They made a great burning for him. So in the final 6 years of King Asa's rule, we see that he uncharacteristically exhibited the ungodly anger. He had an anger toward the truth, and he oppressed God's prophet, and he oppressed God's people, and he oppressed those that, were godly. In the book of the kings of Judah and Israel, remember, is not the canonical books of the Kings, but an earlier court chronicle. In verse 12, the 39th year would make that about 872 BC, that King Asa died as a result of what could have been gangrene or some other foot disease like gout. And Asa continued turning away from the Lord and relying on his own human strength. In verse 13, the 45th year is approximately 870 BC. And due to the longevity of his reign and the notable accomplishments, he was honored by the people in the memorial of his death. And cremation was rarely used by the Hebrews. And later, Jehoram wasn't honored by fire because of his shameful reign. And the closing chapters of his life for King Asa is very discouraging. It's like one of those books, like I mentioned in the start, that you really get drawn to the character, and then you find out, they fell off the deep end. And he went from being a man who trusted in God with great victory and the renewal of God's covenant with his people to a total persecutor of God and his people. In Asa's last years was a time of unbelief. His last years were a time of hardness against God, and his last years was also oppressing against God's people, and we see that he dies a horrific death at this time. And I want to make mention here in verse 12 when it says he did not seek the Lord, but he seeked the physicians. You see, medical practice at this time in the world was not where it is today. There was not as much wisdom or knowledge in the medical profession. And so to wrap up here, we look at the chronicler shows King Asa makes a treaty with Syria to strengthen himself against Israel. And we see the success of Asa's plan. We see God rebuke Asa through his prophet Hanani, and we see Asa reject the message of Hanani, and he gets really upset. He turns against God's prophet. And we see the ending of the sad state of an otherwise promising reign of King Asa and of Judah. And one thing I want to make mention of with today's passage is sometimes people will take verse 12 and they'll show, see, you lack faith if you're going to a human doctor over the Lord. And there's a whole Christian cult, like Christian Science, that gets wrapped up into that mindset. And I want to make mention here that when you read it in context, Asa's being rebuked for avoiding the Lord instead of going to the Lord first. It's not a clear command to say never go to a human doctor. And overall, when you study the Bible, it has a positive view of humanly doctors. But anytime we have an issue, we should be bringing that issue to the Lord and praying about it, not just relying on other human doctors. And the Bible gives a positive about the role of physicians in medical care. We'll go over some of these verses here in Colossians 4:14. Colossians 4:14 says, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. So Luke was a beloved doctor. He's not considered a wicked doctor in the Bible. If God was against us having physical doctors, Luke would not be called the beloved physician by the Apostle Paul. James 5:14 and verse 15. 5:14 says, "Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven." And, as I mentioned, it is biblical for us when we have a health situation, we ought to be having others pray for us when we have whatever types of ailments in our life. And for 1 Timothy chapter 5. First Timothy 5:23, and it says here, "No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and for your frequent infirmities." So, back in this time period, Paul wanted Timothy to use wine and not just water, because water in the ancient world wasn't treated like it is today through our communities. And I know there's some who believe the government is killing us through our water supply, but we're not going to talk those beliefs right now. We're looking at the verse here. And Paul wanted Timothy to use wine because the fermentation of wine at this point in time was a way of disinfectant. It was like a disinfectant. And treatment back at this time period for stomach issues is often used to disinfect that person that's inflicted. And it's never right, though, to seek doctors instead of the Lord, is a point I want to make today. And we must trust in God, and in His will, we must always know that God can use human doctors as an instrument to help us with whatever health challenges we're facing. But that's going to wrap up today's video. I hope I see you again to be determined, as we're going to be looking at the features of Jehoshaphat's reign. So have a great rest of your evening. God bless.